Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us here at MaRS. Appreciate you all coming in as the sort of the first thing that you do after the long weekend. I know it's often tough to make these things work, but I think it will be time that you're very happy that you've spent. Our speaker is Mark McLeod. He's a general partner at Real Ventures, one of Canada's leading seed startup organizations, and it's the largest seed venture fund in the country. He was telling me before, as we were setting up here, that they've just made their 10th seed investment. So they're not only a large fund, they're a fund who's actively writing checks. Before joining Real Ventures, Mark was an entrepreneur himself. He was had a CFO for rent business, startup CFO, and he was also CFO of Tungle as one of those clients, so a company that has recently been in the news. Mark has forgotten more about the economics of software as a service businesses and the metrics of them than most of us will know. And so without further ado, let me give you Mark McLeod. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everyone. Really glad that Mark set the bar really high. So before we start, how many of you have your own startups now? So a lot of people. And are the balance of you thinking of starting a startup? Is that right? And are those startups SaaSy or not? Everyone? A few? Quasi-SaaSy? Okay. Great. And can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So great, so we're going to talk about SaaS math. So first of all, just a little background on myself. So as Mark mentioned, I've very recently moved to the dark side, investing after spending the last 12 years on the company side as a CFO for a bunch of angel and VC-backed startups. So these are some of the companies that I've worked with over the years, either as a full-time CFO or, as Mark mentioned more recently, as a part-time CFO. So some of the companies you may know of there include Tungle, recently bought by RIM, Shopify, pretty kick-ass company up in Ottawa, and TerraScale, Mobivox. Some of the companies, I wanted to put up some of the investments that I've done personally as well. As Mark mentioned, we've done 10 companies. I've personally done 4 of those companies, so Fabric Engine, Moda Suite, Rewardly, and Context.io are my first 4 investments, and 3 of the 4 are SaaS companies. One is e-commerce. So today we're going to talk about why I love and why hopefully you guys love SaaS. We're going to go through an overview of SaaS metrics, some of the factors behind pricing, valuation of SaaS companies. I've put Q&A kind of at the end, but we're a small enough group, so I'm happy to take questions as we go. So why I love SaaS, and by I really mean not me personally, but investors. There's a bunch of reasons why investors love SaaS companies. For one, huge market. You'll see here in this kind of box, it's just SaaS touches so many sectors. You know, it's not just web services, but more and more applications, more and more software that used to be a traditional desktop sold in a perpetual license is now being made available as a service. So a huge and growing market. And as you'll see when we get into the valuation discussion, that SaaS companies, as they start to achieve real kind of predictable traction, are worth a lot more than companies that sell on more traditional business models. So as we get into SaaS metrics, we're going to dine out on some wisdom from these guys here, who I consider to be some of the SaaS gods in the industry. So Dave McClure, I'm sure everyone knows him. Dan Martell, fellow Canadian, who preaches kind of metrics and lean startup stuff. David Cancel is on his second SaaS analytics company called Performable. And David Skok is actually the god of SaaS investing at a Matrix Partners. So that's these 4 guys here. Are you guys all familiar with this metrics for pirates? Everyone heard of this? Some of you? Anyway. So this is a framework that Dave McClure came up with for talking about not strictly SaaS metrics, but I find it's very useful for looking at the funnel for how you attract users to a website and over time convert them to active users and monetize them. So he goes through what he calls R, hence the metrics for pirates. I won't do a long drawn out rolling R for you. You can imagine it. But he goes through the phases from where we acquire users to when we activate them, retain them, get them to refer other users, and then eventually generate revenue from those users. So if we drill into metrics, the first battle, I think, for any SaaS company is acquiring users. And so many of the early stage companies that I deal with are kind of adding one more feature. They think that they need to have a whole bunch of things in place in order to release and start acquiring users. And my message to you is don't. Get out there with a sucky product, have one feature that solves one known problem for one clearly identified set of customers, and as soon as you have that, get out. And Reid Hoffman, who's the startup world's newest billionaire after the LinkedIn IPO last week, has a great saying, which is, if you look back on your first product release and you're not embarrassed by it, you released too late. I think that's great wisdom. So it's a given to me that when you first start acquiring users, you're going to lose them, meaning that they're going to come, sign up, and either not get it or not stay, and that's perfectly fine. But it's a way for you to test, first of all, your ability to acquire users, to see where they're coming from, which acquisition channels work, which messaging works. You should be A/B testing everything. So don't hesitate to get out there and start acquiring users. Ultimately, though, while acquisition is the first battle, ultimately it's about retention. And we're going to get into the metrics, but churn, which is the rate at which your users abandon the service, is actually the most important metric for long-term SaaS success. And I'll explain in great detail why that is. So let's look at what to measure. In part one, we're going to look at the funnel, which is how you go from driving users to or visitors to your website, converting a bunch of them to sign up, getting them to go through trials if it's something that has a sales cycle, or otherwise just using a free service if there is no sales cycle, and ultimately generating revenue for you. And I should mention, by the way, I'll post these slides on my blog later today, so they'll all be up there. So what should you measure when it comes to acquisition? These are just some of the metrics that I think matter. The first battle obviously is driving traffic to your website. So you're looking at new unique visitors over whatever time frame, whether that is weekly or monthly, from that new users, so people that sign up. And so there's some very basic conversion rates that come out of that, which is your conversion rate from unique visitor to sign up. And looking at changes in conversion rates. If you're generating a predictable 10% conversion to sign up, and then suddenly it goes to 8, you need to look at why. Conversely, if it goes to 12, you need to look at why. You need to look at your traffic mix in terms of new versus returning. That's true for both visitors and for actual users who are signed up. You definitely need to be looking at your sources to understand which sources of traffic work for you. I'll take a sidebar just to talk about paid traffic. And while I mentioned that you should release your application or service as early as possible, I discourage companies from paying for acquisition, so doing like meaningful PPC or other paid acquisition campaigns, until they've really kind of gotten churn down to a predictable level, because otherwise you're guaranteed to be losing money. Use free and viral channels, like spam your friends, do whatever you need to do to get those early users for free before, and kind of nail the user experience and get churn down to a reasonable level before testing paid channels. And I think the last thing you should be measuring is I think for every step in your funnel, and really I think every aspect of your business, it's really important to set targets right out of the gate. And set targets for unique visitors this week and next week and the week after, and same for sign up, same for active. I find that the businesses that grow the fastest are ones that actually give themselves some accountability and set some targets for themselves. After acquisition comes activation. And so, the most base metric there is to be looking at new active users and your conversions from someone who's just signed up for a service to someone who has now actually used the service. And activation simply means that they've used the thing once. I don't know what type of SaaS companies you're working on, but there are many startups out there that have kind of very low activation rates. So if you're working on something that has a social network aspect component to it, maybe only 5 to 10% of your users will be truly engaged and participating. And then you'll have another bunch that are simply kind of looking at what's going on, and a bunch that have signed up and are completely and utterly inactive. So whereas if you're using a real application, one that people have to pay to use, then you're going to have much higher kind of activation rates. But again, you're sort of looking at the same things. You're looking at activation rates and which sources are driving the most active users. And there's different ways to get at this, but something that's really important is to identify if a new user comes on, a new potential user comes onto your website, to log the source that that user came from, like that first contact that brought them to your website, and then to match that offline to their user record if they create an account. And the reason to do that is that ultimately, if you start seeing that your really high quality users come from a certain channel, then you want to be doing more of that stuff. So I'll give you an example. We started doing that at Tungle, and we found that people who came from blog posts that were explaining the service turned out to be like 5 times more active than people that kind of came to us directly. And the reason, as we drilled into it, of course, is that they were already sort of pre-qualified. They had already had the service explained to them. There were probably screenshots in the blog post, and by the time they arrived on our site, they already knew what it was and were more inclined to sign up. That told us a couple of things. First of all, our website is not doing a good enough job in and of itself, so we need to make it as explanatory as these blog posts. And second, we should be going out and doing a whole bunch more PR to get more blog posts. So really understanding the sources of your best users is important, so that over time, you know, your funnel might be like this out of the gate, where you have a bunch of people that come up and only a small portion of whom become active users, but over time you want to flatten that funnel out. So activation in that framework, that Metrics for Pirates framework that Dave put up, activation refers strictly to the first time somebody uses your service. For second time and beyond, really you're talking about retention. And the key measures there are something called cohort or class analysis. Do you guys know what that is, or should I talk about that? I'll talk about that. So cohorts or classes, the way to look at this, or the way I've done it with my companies, is kind of looking at a month as a cohort. So everyone who signed up in January 2011 is one cohort. Everyone who signed up in February is another. Everyone who signed up in March is another. And the whole point of this is to look at their activation or referral or monetization rates as they go through time. So everyone who signed up in January, look at how many of them continue to be active in February and March, April, and so on. Do the same thing for everyone who signed up in February. And what you find over time is you get very predictable churn rates, which is rates at which people kind of abandon the service over 30, 60, and 90 days. And what I have found is that you get really, really high churn rates initially. Many people will sign, and this is particularly true for freemium services because it's literally free to sign up, which means there's no barriers. And so many people will sign up. Maybe early adopters, could be software developers like you. They just want to see the user interface. They're not really intending to use it. They're just curious. They want to check it out. So you'll find really, really high churn rates out of the gate. I find that 60-day churn rates are also pretty high. And after about 90 days, if you can get people past 90 days, I've found across many, many companies that you tend to keep those users. So I look at 30, 60, 90-day churn on activation and retention. And I do the same thing on revenue. So customers who are actually paying you and then stop paying you. But we're going to drill into that in much more detail. In the same way as we looked at changes in conversion rates on sign-up, you definitely need to do the same on retention. And I would say that it's much more important because retention is the most important metric to the success of a startup business. So if your churn rate goes up by 1%, that's a really big issue, and you need to really understand why it is that it's gone up. Something I recommend that companies do is to stratify your user base. And there's different ways to do that. It could be by activity volume. So if you take a month, look at the people who use the service, like I'm making numbers up, but look at people who've used the service 10 or more times, 5 to 10, 2 to 5, 1, etc. And the whole point of that is to understand, to look at who they are, what sources they came from. If it's a business app, what types of organizations they come from, what size of organizations, and to understand, I think, the two extremes. First of all, the people who are not using the service, to try and find out why they're not using the service. And for the people that are really what I call kind of power users and are really engaging with it, to find out who they are and why. And I think ultimately what you want to do is not try and solve the case of no usage, but really go after more and more of the people who really are your power users. And every startup is going to have its own specific engagement metrics that it wants to capture that are kind of beyond the core conversion rates, but it could be mentions, likes, etc. if it's a social app. In terms of virality, there's a metric called K factor. There's different ways to characterize this, but which is just looking at for every usage of your service, for every user who's active, how many new users are they generating for you? And I can give you another example in the Tungle case. And I don't know how many have used the Tungle service, but Tungle was a service for helping business professionals figure out when to meet. And so what we found is that for every 4 people that were invited to a meeting using Tungle that were not already Tungle users, they would say, hey, this is a cool service, and become a Tungle user. And so referral was a really big acquisition source for us. And as you break down your K factor, you need to understand kind of the big drivers and what it is that's driving referral. If I'm going too fast or there's questions, let me know. Yeah.
Expand a little bit on that coefficient. I know I've seen the math before, and I don't necessarily want the math, just an understanding of kind of what the drivers are, or how you think about that.
So yeah, well, in the Tungle case, a driver was meeting requests to non-users. And then there was a certain conversion rate of people who were not users who were exposed to the service and said, hey, I think I'll sign up for this thing. This was a cool experience, who then became Tungle users. So there's different things that was just pure usage of the service that drove it in that case, but there are other ways to do it. Many applications have kind of an invite a friend function or, add followers or something. I find that invite a friend doesn't work that well, especially in the early days, asking. There's some services that will try and do that during your onboarding process. So as you're getting your own account set up, they ask you if you want to invite your friends, and I find that's way too premature because you don't know whether you're doing your friends a service or not at that stage because you haven't even tried the thing out. So it's something I recommend that companies implement later, but don't expect huge benefits from it. It's just something to do on the checklist. But where the Tungle experience by itself was kind of inherently viral, and that's more what you want to engineer. So build some sort of viral loop right into the actual experience versus asking people to do some sort of tangent thing on behalf of the company. Yep.
I mean, with marketing apps such as Shopify, at what stage does, for example, like not necessarily affiliates, but kind of a bit more of the soft referral with a commission coming into it? At what stage does that come into the planning? Is that a revenue decision, or is that baked into evaluating referrals right at the beginning?
It depends in different cases, right? So, Freshbooks and Shopify, I think they'll give you like money, for referrals, and so obviously that's more tied to generating paid customers. But if you think of Dropbox as an example, they were giving away extra storage for referrals right out of the gate. So I think it comes down, I don't think there's one hard rule per se. Definitely if you're having a formal affiliate channel, they're coin-operated machines. Affiliates are looking for money, and therefore it has to be when your app is generating revenue. But I do think, and I think this is a really important theme, that for SaaS companies, you really need to shower your users with love. And I'm not trying to be corny, but it actually comes back to that whole churn metric, which is, I think that, I'm going to go on a tangent now, but I think that people buy technology from startups for one of two reasons. One, it's a technology that they can't get anywhere else, or two, it's a level of service and support and love that they can't get anywhere else. And I find that the startups that really kind of do really well and take off have showered their users with love. And where you send a request to support and you hear back right away, and they've got a very active blog and they build a community. And so Freshbooks is another great example, right? Every time an executive from Freshbooks is going to a different city, they're having dinners for the users in that city. And that doesn't really make economic sense for a company that charges $30 a month or whatever they charge, but they're building massive loyalty. And then those users are going out and becoming ambassadors and helping recruit more users, not in a hard sort of affiliate commission sense, but just sort of in a goodwill sense. And I think there's many, many examples of SaaS companies that have huge amounts of goodwill that helps them acquire users for free or cheap. So on the revenue side, there's a bunch of things that you want to measure. Obviously, at a base level, you want to look at the portion of your users that convert to start paying you money. You definitely want to be looking at average revenue per user. That's what ARPU is all about, and changes in that. The cohort analysis again, so how many of your users that signed up to pay you in month 1 are continuing to pay you in month 2, month 3, etc., and changes in that. I think you want to be very close to the reasons that people cancel. There's different ways to do that. You could call them up in a survey style. We usually recommend hitting them up with a really short, easy to answer email, just with a check a box here for the reason why you canceled. It's super important to understand that because it's usually something about your product. It's not usually a financial decision. It's the product is not meeting some expectation of those users. You want to be looking if you have different price plans, what portion of your users are upgrading to the different price plans. And again, going back to understanding the source of your best users, if one channel is delivering you people that convert to paid at a much higher rate, then you want to be all over that channel. So again, you want to go back to that first source. And this is actually a real challenge because it depends on the app. But so you mentioned Shopify before. So Shopify if you're an online merchant, you're making a decision to run on that platform, which means you're probably going to come to that website several times before ultimately putting in your credit card and saying, okay, this is the thing I'm going to run on. And so it's important for Shopify to understand the true first source, not the last source of traffic before that person became a customer. So there is a measurement challenge there because for SaaS vendors, because the customer may come to your site several times from different channels before ultimately saying, okay, I'm going to choose this one. So let's talk about, first of all, before I go on, are there any questions on metrics there that I blasted through? If not, we're going to talk about per user economics. So here's kind of the elements in per user economics for a SaaS startup. So you have average revenue per user, that's whatever you charge your customers per month, times the life of a user, which is how many months you get to keep that customer. And this is exactly why churn is so important, right? If I get to keep a customer for 20 months versus 10 months, they're twice as valuable. That's the limit of my math skills, by the way, right there. So that's the sole reason why churn is so important. So number of revenue per month times the number of months we get to keep that customer times the margin, which is usually very, very high. That's just kind of hosting costs, less whatever it cost us to acquire that customer, generates sort of a customer lifetime value. So if this is $100, I have a 20% margin, so I got 80, and it costs me 30 to acquire that user ultimately is worth $50 to me. Hopefully it's more than that, but that's kind of how it works. And so just beating that churn point over the head, very simple graph, and this is from David Scock's blog, right? So if I get to keep a user, if I have 1% per month churn, I get to keep that user for 100 months. 2%, I keep them for half the time. 5%, I only keep the user for 20 months. So if I have a very simple web service that I'm charging $5 a month for, that user, before margin and acquisition costs, could be worth either $500 or $100. And if it's $500, that fundamentally affects how I go to market. I can use much more expensive channels. I can go after more and more users. Whereas if that user is worth only $100 to me, I'm much more limited. And so, again, I'm beating a dead horse, but this is why churn is so important, because if your churn rates are out of control, it really impacts your ability to grow as a business. And by the way, in case you're wondering what target churn rates are, they're really between 2 and 5% a month. If you're north of that, there's something broken. So let's drill into customer acquisition cost. There's a few ways to calculate this. There's elements that go in, which is kind of staffing costs. And there's two types of staffing costs that I think are relevant to measuring customer acquisition. Clearly, anyone who's part of your marketing team, but I also increasingly put in people who are part of the support team. And customer support is really the secret weapon for, in some cases, attracting users, but definitely for retaining users. So like in the Shopify example, when you sign up for for an account and you want to start building your online store, we're all over you. We've got a support guru who's going to contact you and help you get set up. And so even though that person wasn't responsible for getting you to sign up, they weren't part of the acquisition process, they are super critical in actually getting you up and running with your online store, and are therefore critical in keeping you as a paid customer for a long time. And so we include their salaries as well as the marketing salaries as part of acquisition cost. Obviously, anything you do from PPC or other paid programs is part of that. And then I would say travel, events, PR, if you've got a PR firm and retainer, all of those elements go into what it costs you to acquire a user. There's two calculation methods. The basic method is just looking at those kind of pure variable costs, so all the program and paid acquisition spend, and the loaded is included with salaries. And I don't think the basic is super valuable, to be honest. I think you need to do it with your salaries. And then you could look at it kind of, before and after churn. So how much should you spend? It definitely depends on churn. And I think as soon as you have your churn rates under control, you want to spend quite aggressively. Bessemer Venture Partners has a great framework out there, I think, called the Laws of SaaS, and they recommend going up to a year or more of a customer's lifetime value. So if a customer is worth $10 a month, be willing to spend up to $120 a month to acquire that customer. I feel that is a bit aggressive, particularly for younger startups, for two reasons. One, I think you need a fair bit of operating history to know predictably what your churn rates are. And second, as you'll see when we go into an example, you need a lot of capital to actually acquire users if you're willing to spend a year of that user's worth to acquire them. And the reason is that you spend all that money to acquire them on day one, but you only actually get money back from the customer over time. And so even though the customer might be profitable on paper, in terms of actually cash in and out, you're spending a lot of cash up front and only getting it back over time. Yeah, go ahead.
What is a minimum amount of users to start calculating churn?
I don't think there's a hard minimum per se. I don't recommend doing meaningful paid acquisition until churn is under control. So you shouldn't be spending a lot of money until such time as churn. Actually, you shouldn't be spending any money until churn is under control. I think it's never too early to start measuring churn on actives. Like I think the first month you launch your service, you should be looking at it. I actually, for many of my startups, would do it weekly until I had enough months that I could do it monthly. I think it's just a super important metric. I think you have to be on top of it immediately. Now, you can't draw extrapolatable, meaningful conclusions if you have 100 users versus 1,000 or 10,000, obviously. But I just think you have to be on top of it. It's so critical. So I would never wait to measure it. But looking at churn of paid users, to me, assumes that your startup has gotten to a point in time where it has stabilized churn rates on its active users and is trending towards that sort of 5 to 2% a month churn of paid, which means it's no longer a brand new startup to me. Daniel.
So with applications such as Shopify, where it's a marketing application, and especially very early on, isn't churn more important in terms of, because if they're going to make the decision to purchase, it's probably a pretty long-term decision.
Mm-hmm.
So at that stage, do you look at more, are they completing accounts versus, or how they're progressing through the creation stage rather than the usage stage? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, the biggest battle for us is getting them to use Shopify as their e-commerce store. And yeah, there's kind of big, once that's up and running and you've populated it and you're driving traffic to that site, it's kind of a pain in the ass to switch. So
benchmarks along that kind of funnel? Or?
But it happens usually in a 30-day time frame.
Okay.
So it's not a really, really long process. So we have process benchmarks within that kind of support guru team that I talked about to make sure that we reach out during those 30 days and to help you get up and running. But in terms of churn, it's not really happening inside that kind of 30-day window. But we do find, I mean, Shopify is not pure freemium, and we're going to talk about freemium later on under the pricing, but we do kind of a 30-day trial, right? And so we do find there are people who will go through those 30 days. You have to give the credit card up front, but we won't charge you until after the 30 days. But we do find there are people who will go through and at the end of those 30 days, not actually convert, which is, for us, an onboarding issue. It's never usually about, it's not the money, it's not because our solution is too expensive. It means we didn't get them up and running properly. So that, for us, is part of acquisition. It's part of making sure that we have acquired a paid user. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I recommend that that SaaS companies in the early stages spend no more than 6 months of a customer's value in order to acquire them, but be willing over time to go up to the marginal lifetime value of a user. So on average, you're spending no more than 6 months, but be willing to, if a user's worth $500, be willing at the incremental, kind of the very last user you're acquiring, be willing to go as high as that value. And the reason is that means you're being as aggressive as possible in terms of your user acquisition. Again, that presupposes that you have the capital in order to fund that, which is a separate issue. But that's when, if I know that a startup has gone as high, I guess to say that incremental last user, they've been willing to spend up to that user's lifetime value. I know they've been as aggressive as possible on user acquisition. So let's talk about how to measure. Those screenshots that I was showing earlier, this is all of them together now. This is actually a mock-up of a dashboard that we built at Akoa, and we built this internally. And I found that many startups end up building stuff internally. With Shopify, we sat down and put a one-page Excel thing together of everything they needed to measure. And Shopify is really, really technically strong. And they went and hired this crazy hacker who spent a month building an unbelievable data warehouse. So internally, we can just measure everything. And I really find that data is the secret weapon for SaaS startups. You need to be measuring everything, and you need to be really, really data-driven. And so I find that even though I'm going to point out some commercial solutions that are very good, I find that ultimately the SaaS startups that perform the best build their own in-house analytics. And just like your own application, it starts small and grows. You know, Shopify started from an Excel sheet and turned into, I think, a data warehouse that could be a company unto itself, to be honest. It's so strong. Tungle, we did the same thing. We built a our own thing that by this guy Jason Knudsen. So instead of Salesforce, we called it Neuterforce. And again, really strong package that could have been spun out into a company. But if you don't have the time or capabilities to build internally, there are some off-the-shelf solutions that are pretty good. Performable is a really great solution that I recommend checking out. That was that dude, David Cancel, back when I was showing the pictures. And it's really good not just for kind of back office analytics, but really helping you test different flows and messaging right on your website. So it can be built right into your app or website. And it's great for SaaS and for e-commerce. RJ Metrics is just pure kind of back office measuring your conversion rates and your analytics. You just need to make a copy of your database. And my only issue with them is that then that's exposing your database data. So that's my one concern with that. And also it's a bit more expensive, but $750 a month, but really comprehensive analytics. And then there are some kind of specific case analytics packages such as Mixpanel and KISS. And KISS is not necessarily going to give you everything that you need to run your business, but it's going to help you understand some specific flows, like that flow of traffic to acquisition. There's different flows you can run with it. And ultimately, if you become a big badass company versus a little startup, you can get enterprise-grade packages such as SaaS. But as I say, I really find that most of my companies do custom. Yeah?
Talk a bit about Mixpanel with good, bad.
I haven't spent it. That's the one I've spent the least time on. My understanding is it's sort of between, so KISS is really good for sort of some specific flows, but is not necessarily going to be something that you run all of your business on. RJ or Performable you could run your business on, and Mixpanel is somewhere in between. I don't know if anyone else has had experience with Mixpanel and could offer additional thoughts, but that's kind of where I position them, kind of KISS, then Mix, then RJ, Performable, and then SaaS on the really high end. So I don't know how much you can see this, but I thought it'd be useful to talk about, just to show a very simple example and just kind of talk through some of the concepts that we've covered. So I've just thrown a 6-month flow up there where we're showing kind of users and registrations and active users and paid and monthly recurring revenue and costs and all that good stuff. Can you guys see that? So I'm just starting here, my first month. I come out of the gate, I got 10,000 new unique visitors who come to the site. That grows over time. Out of those, I've got 1,000 people who sign up, and again, that grows over time. Out of the people that sign up, a certain portion of them become active. Out of the people that are active, a certain portion are paid and remain paid, but you'll see as I go from here, I've got some churn, right? So they kind of cancel out. And that generates at $5 a month a certain amount of revenue. And again, I've got churn in my revenue as well. So these are all the kind of concepts that we've covered before. I'm going to show the conversion rates behind these in a minute. Hosting costs, which come down to margin, how much I paid to acquire a user, and my contribution at the end of the day. And one thing that's important to point out here is that even though these users are profitable on a per user basis, which I think we're going to show in this, if not, anyway, they are. From a contribution standpoint, I'm actually generating a deficit, which means I'm spending more to acquire customers each month than I'm generating in revenue, which points out a really important theme for SaaS businesses, which is that it's generally hard to bootstrap them. I'm not saying it's impossible, but generally hard to bootstrap and do it on a self-funded basis, especially if you want to actually grow at a meaningful pace. You can kind of go along kind of a very slow pace and generate enough margin to go and pay to acquire a few more users. But if you really want to kill it and own your market, generally speaking, you need to raise some capital. Yep.
Most of that money seems to be on the marketing front and on the exposure front.
Yep. Yeah. And whether that is staffing costs is directly attributable to acquisition, or whether it's programs or both, yeah, for sure.
So as a general percentage of let's say you get $1 million, what would you portion that to?
Well, I find, and this percentage is held true, I don't know why that thing keeps falling. This percentage is generally held true for almost every startup I've ever been involved with, is that they tend to spend 80 cents of every dollar on staff, including benefits. Now, that's all staff, not strictly kind of customer acquisition related staff, but staff is a meaningful portion of spend, so 70 to 80. And then another 10 maybe is pure kind of program related acquisition.
So I'm kind of confused. So you say 80% of the money to acquire new customers?
No, I'm saying just generally, if you look at the expenses,
Yeah,
so I give you $1 million for, yeah.
To actually, out of your $1 million, how much would you actually spend on stuff that requires getting new customers? Just trying to, the reason I'm asking is that if I'm trying to budget how much money we need to set aside to
Mhm.
get, 20 customers in January, for example, how
Mhm.
much of my entire budget would I be getting?
So each company is different, right? There are some startups that are able to really kind of just leverage very tactical online free channels. So we just hire some kind of young, friendly, web-centric people who are out there and active on Twitter and on forums and are just driving traffic, and that converts, in which case most of the spend is just these kind of young people who put their headphones on and just type all day, every day. Whereas other companies were doing kind of meaningful paid acquisition. So the mix between salaries versus paid is different in every case. But the sum of those two, in my mind, should never be more than 6 months of your monthly per user revenue. That should be the target. Anyway, so that was just a basic illustration. And from that generates these conversion rates. So first of all, and again, these were all metrics that I thought we should measure back in the earlier portion of the talk. So we're looking at growth in visitors, we're looking at growth in signups. We got a 10% conversion rate, 20% of people who sign up actually become active, 10% of those people become paid. And by the way, these I find are actually pretty accurate benchmarks for most freemium applications, which means you need to drive a crap load of users in order to get a lot of paid users out of the other end. And pretty high churn. I find that churn, and again, this is absolutely the case with a free application because there's no barriers to entry, which means there's no barriers to exit. That's just the game that you sign up for. So you're going to get super, super high churn. So 70% of people who sign up who are active in month 1, as an example, will just go radio silent in month 2. That's totally happens all the time. Whereas on the paid side, people who've actually gone through and used it enough and actually pulled out their credit card, again, you will have some abandonment in the first couple of months, but the churn rate on paid is usually much lower than it is on active. If it's not, you got a big issue. Chris?
Just to clarify, following the example from the previous slide, you wouldn't even be putting money into your acquisition if you're at 10% churn, right?
Yeah.
You said 5% is your kind of...
Yeah. You maybe test it out a little bit, but you test it out knowing you're burning money.
Yeah.
And so you don't start doing real spend until you're down in that 5% per month range. So we're going to talk about pricing next. And I wish I could give you some exact pricing magic, but there isn't any. It's a subjective decision. It has many different elements to the equation. And so here are some of them. First of all, kind of how hard is your benefit? If you're generating money for me versus saving me time, I'm going to pay you more as a general rule. And your positioning, are you sort of a high-end exclusive thing, or are you kind of volume going for mass market? Again, so high versus low. Who you're going after as an end customer. Is this a consumer play or is it a business user? If it's a consumer play, it's actually pretty hard to monetize directly. You're going to be monetizing that probably indirectly. If it's a business app, then you could probably charge. Yeah.
Just a question on the pricing for consumer apps. How do you think about the mobile space? I guess that's a different equation in terms of pricing.
Well, I mean, I would say Apple's market cap definitely validates that people are willing to spend money on mobile apps. I think the challenge for you as a developer is twofold. One, it's not a channel that you control. Actually, it's threefold. So you don't really control that channel. It's very hits driven. If you can get into that kind of top app category, then you're a happy guy. Otherwise, not so much. Then there's the 30% tax to consider. And you know, if I'm selling a web service, I'm able to charge that every month, and it's hard to get kind of meaningful recurring revenue happening in the mobile channel at the moment. And I think it's criminal sometimes. I'm using these really great apps that I paid $2 for. It kind of sucks. I'm cheap and Scottish, so I'm happy to save the money, but as a software guy, I really am sort of sympathetic to the fact that the thing I'm using is probably worth a lot more than that. So it's a challenging channel, but it's clearly, you can't ignore it. And these things are going to get figured out, and Apple's making enough money now that other app stores are going to come up, right? Innovia in Montreal just backed a company out of San Francisco called AppDirect that's offering kind of a portfolio of mobile app stores. And ultimately there are going to be channels that are better for you as a mobile developer than the Apple one. So yeah, just elements in the pricing decision. Yeah, the value prop, whether you're positioned on the high end or the low end, whether you're selling to consumers versus businesses, whether there are direct alternatives out there. If there are, you're pretty much going to have to be similar to them in pricing or be very clearly better. I think that how you sell has a big impact on what you can charge. So if you have a direct sales force that goes out and visits customers and there's a big sales cycle, that's going to be a very expensive piece of software that you're selling. Whereas if you just market online and there's a heavy virality, you can charge a lot less and go after a big volume. As that obviously ultimately informs acquisition cost. If it costs you $50 to acquire a user, you need to be charging a certain minimum amount. So I threw out just a couple of illustrations of different companies that you may or may not be familiar with and how much they charge, and thought we could just look at what this tells us about how they arrived at their pricing decision. And Dropbox, obviously a phenomenal success. People say this is on its way to being a $100 million company. And yet I always thought their pricing was kind of whack. I mean, first of all, way too generous on the free usage. And I wanted to pay these guys, I think, 3 months before I actually ran out of space and became a user, because I kept referring people and kept getting more and more space. And then there's really only 2 pricing tiers. There's like a $10 and I forget how much the other one is, but all they're selling is more capacity. And I thought there would have been a way for them to bake in some different tiers and maybe have some management features or higher security or some kind of analytics or something to get more money out of me. But hey, they're successful, so all good. And I would say by pricing at $10 versus a higher amount, they're gunning for the masses. They want to be the standard. They want to have tons and tons of users. They clearly do have tons and tons of users. They don't want price to be a factor in the decision to use their service versus another. Tribe HR is a local startup in Waterloo. I would say a softer, great service, great guys running it, but it's a softer benefit. It's helping me save money in managing my employee force. It's not making me money. It's not saving me hard costs. And I would say $20 a month is on the upper end of what you can get for a value proposition like that. Basecamp is one of the 37 Signal suite of products, an absolute standard for many web developers and web designers. It's right in the flow of how a web design shop, which is their bread and butter, makes money. This is where you run your projects to build websites for clients, and they've been able to extract quite a lot of money from. I think for the feature set that's there, it's pretty expensive. Highrise is one of their products. It's a CRM, and pretty soft benefit. There's a zillion online CRM solutions you could use. I think that they're, it's a similar price point to Tribe HR, again, because it's not a hard kind of monetizable benefit. Freshbooks is an interesting case, and we're going to do a case study on them actually in a little bit, but they have a base plan that starts at $20. And again, they're kind of gunning for the masses, but their price points go up over time because they are right in the stream of how you make money if you use them for billing. Same thing for Shopify. HubSpot, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with that, but they sell to businesses versus users. And there's a sales cycle involved. There's an inside sales rep who calls you the second that you sign up for an account, and they charge a lot more as a result. And Salesforce, again, they have a kind of a version that you can sign up for as an individual user, but really their bread and butter is doing sales cycles, selling to an entire enterprise. And so the true kind of cost is much, much more than you see here.
Before you move on from that, when you look at the HubSpot or Salesforce, where there's more of a traditional sales model in the enterprise, called the enterprise space, or certainly the business-to-business space, do you find that all the same metrics in SaaS apply?
Yeah, I do, for sure. You have different, you're using a different method to get there, but you still are going through a trial. There's a trial there that's happening at some point in your sales cycle. It's just that you're supporting that trial not through automated messages or some kind of online onboarding. You're supporting it through webinars or going out to visit them, but it's this exact same process.
But similar to Daniel's point, I think where measuring the churn piece is where I'm not so clear on that, because ultimately when you buy, at that point you're pretty hooked. And Salesforce, for example, while they have a SaaS offering, will often ask you to prepay 3 years in advance, and that's becoming more and more standard in the enterprise space as enterprise software vendors move to SaaS models,
because they're used to selling
perpetually. Yeah, they want, how do you commission your sales reps, for instance, and,
right.
and that sort of thing. So I assume there must be a different way to sort of measure churn, sort of from the point of contact, the first point of contact, to all the steps that make up the the decision process to buy, and then when you bought, you're sort of hooked for some period of time.
Yeah, I would look at
earlier, right?
I would look at, so if I'm trying to sell to enterprise, as I'm going through that funnel of activation, right? So I've reached out to a bunch of enterprises. I've done a first contact with some. I've acquired some leads. And then during that sort of activation phase, because there's anything that's big ticket, there's a trial portion of that. And trials that don't convert to paid, so they kind of abandon midstream, or they say this isn't the solution for me and move on, is the proxy for that, right? And then I would say for everyone in the room, I think I'm going to touch on this, offering an annual prepay option with a discount is a huge, huge strategy. You absolutely have to do it for a couple of reasons. One, for cash flow reasons, but second, it's a really good barometer of product market fit, because if customers trust you enough and are willing to actually give you to prepay for a year, you've built a solution for them. And so I think you should do it. I think that there's no one in this room who could get a 3-year prepay out of a customer. If you do, then I genuflect before you.
Another way actually to look at that, though, again in the enterprise space, is the ability for the customer to pay you on a monthly basis. Is again, they're also kind of converting their budget processes and so on to you can't go back to the board and ask for money every month or even every quarter. So sometimes it's easier for them to prepay a year or more.
It is. I find that. I do find that. But I do find, and that very first slide was kind of why investors love SaaS, but I do find that customers love SaaS as well, because it does give them more budget predictability. Even if they may prepay, because it's a pain in the ass to get a check out of their ERP system, so they'd rather do it at once, but they still know it's in their operating budget versus a capital budget, so there's a much easier kind of cycle to get it through. And also a lot more vendor accountability, right? If I bought enterprise software on a perpetual license, then I'm tied into maintenance, and whether I use it or not, I'm stuck. Whereas if it's SaaS, even if I did prepay it, if I don't like the thing, I can turn it off. So I do find customers like it more, and vendors like it more as well, because you've got predictability of customer value.
I won't take up time now, but I'll ask you more questions after
Okay.
the prepay question.
That's cool. So we're going to talk next about freemium, which is having a free base version and using that to acquire paid users, which to me is falls under the kind of the discussion of pricing and is an important element. So to me, there are 4 necessary conditions to employ a freemium strategy for your business. First of all, you need to be going after a huge market. And the reason is that you need a crap load of free users in order to get a meaningful amount of paid users out of that. The incremental cost to serve those users should be pretty close to 0. So my 4th startup was a company named MobiVox. We were in the Voice 2.0 space, so kind of a free or cheap calling alternative. And we totally violated this rule and we paid for it. So we were attracting users to sign up for our calling service, but we were paying real termination costs to like Teleglobe and other operators every time our users were using it. So we actually didn't want our free users to use the service, and therefore there was a disconnect, and fundamentally, there's a bunch of other reasons why it didn't work, but there was a real flaw in the business model. And so if you don't really want free users using your service, you shouldn't use freemium. And there's a whole host of companies that use it who get real value from their free users. The Tongle case I mentioned, right? If 1 out of every 4 meeting invites generates another user, that's all good. That's kind of a virtuous cycle. There's so many examples I could give of that. So that's a key thing. There should be a clear upgrade path, sort of clear limits in what the base version provides. Should be a meaningful sort of standalone product, but where there's clear differentiators between the free and the paid, so I can try the free enough to really get a sense that it meets my needs, but then as my needs progress, I have to start whipping out my credit card. If the benefits and the differentiation are not hard enough, what you're going to find is you have a big free user base and very little monetization. And clearly, if you're going to be going out and acquiring a bunch of free users and then monetizing them down the road, that again supposes you have some funding to put food in your staff's mouths along the way. Reasons for me to use freemium is, it reduces the barriers to trying the application, obviously. I also think increasingly on the web, there's an expectation of free. I think we as users are pretty spoiled, so we expect everything to be free, so that's an issue. But if you do have a free-based version and your competitors don't, or the incumbents don't, then there's an opportunity to clearly disrupt the market and start acquiring large market share. And if there are network effects built into your application or network, then again, that's hugely valuable. So let's take LinkedIn, since they're topical, and talk about that, right? So LinkedIn has sort of a 3-prong freemium business model. Most of you, if you have LinkedIn accounts, probably don't pay them money, but they have a crap load of users. And so recruiters pay LinkedIn money in order to access that network. And so the more people that are on the network, the more valuable that network is, which means the more recruiters sign up for subscriptions. So there's kind of a network effect and a virtuous cycle there. And then the 3rd prong is advertising, which is more and more valuable the more and more users they have on it. So they have executed freemium really, really well. So we've talked about this, but yeah, 2 types of freemium to me. One is just free base version and you get users to sign up, which is direct monetization, and then indirect is where you have a base of free users and people pay to access that base, either through ads or a subscription to get enhanced access in the LinkedIn example. So I thought we'd take a look at a couple of case studies of direct and indirect. One is Freshbooks. So you'll see here they've got a free plan. And so as you're starting out your services business, you can sign up for a Freshbooks account, and for your first 3 customers, you don't pay them any money. And then as soon as you start making money and start being successful, you got to start paying them money. And it goes up, it's pretty generous. After I got 25 clients, I'm probably predisposed to start paying them a bit more money. So they've completely reduced the barriers to getting started. And as you start being successful in your business, you start paying them more money. So I find that there's really kind of good alignment. And it's not that expensive to get on kind of an all-you-can-eat plan. Mint.com, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with them, but this is a completely free-to-use service. And you enter your credit card and your bank data, and then it sucks everything in, and you can manage all of your personal finances. But you may or may not know it, but really it's in the lead generation business. What it's doing is generating referrals it's more relevant in the US where there actually is competition in banking and insurance and other categories, but really what they're doing is generating leads for financial products to sell you. So whether you need car insurance or a mortgage or you want to move to a different bank, and that's how they monetize. So yeah, I talked about annual prepay and the importance of it. And this is just taking that exact same example we did a few slides ago and looking at the difference cash flow wise between people paying monthly versus people prepaying. And you know, in the prepay case, in the monthly case, I'm generating a deficit every month. In the prepay case, I'm generating, you know, significant positive cash flow every month. Now, in my experience, it's rare for more than 10% of subscribers to prepay, but it's definitely worth going after. So let's look at valuations now. And again, I wish there was some sort of hard algorithm. And you know, most of you here, I assume, have young startups, or your startups are not even born yet. And so at this stage, there is no multiple. There's no 3x, 4x of revenue because you don't have revenue. And to be honest, it's all of these other factors that go into determining what your company's worth. First and foremost, it's the team. And for us as seed investors, I could tell you that our decision to invest in a startup is 60 to 70% based on the assessment of the team. It's not based on a pro forma model or other stuff. It's based on how strong we think the entrepreneur is and the track record of that team. So if this is your first new startup, doesn't mean we won't fund you, but if you just exited a startup in that space and now you're coming back to do it again, like David Cancel with Performable after selling his last company to Omniture, I think, you're going to be worth a lot more. Clearly, any traction that you have. So, you know, for us as seed investors, you know, we found in our first fund, we would be backing some people at the idea stage. And we find now with the second fund, we're absolutely willing to back people at the idea stage, but increasingly, people who walk in the door already have built something and in many cases have it out in the market. So at the very least, we've got a product we can touch and feel, if not actual user metrics. And you know all the reasons, right? You know, you don't need capital to get something in market these days. This open source stack is very robust. There's free channels you can leverage. And so all other things being equal, if you come in and meet some investors and have actual user metrics, that's going to make them really kind of pay attention. And if those metrics are positive, they're going to be in a rush to give you some money. Clearly opportunity size, if you're going after a huge, huge market, then your company is going to be worth more. And ultimately, and unfortunately this is not an issue in Canada, if there's competition for your deal, then you're going to be worth more, right? And so we've been looking, we have one company that we invested in with 500 startups. They're down in the valley, and the pre-monies there are just nuts. You know, this 3-month-old company that's worth $5 million. I just can't get my head around it. So I'm thinking our whole fund strategy should be fund them here, and then send them down to the valley to raise the Series A, and then on paper we're going to be worth like this. Anyway. So as I say, in the early stages, it's about those factors. It's about team, traction, opportunity size. Once you actually get into meaningful revenue, then there are reliable valuation benchmarks that you can use. This is from Software Equity Group, looking at the last few quarters, and you'll see the blue line is price revenue multiple, so the valuation of the company divided by annual revenues. For traditional software in red and SaaS in blue. And you'll see the SaaS valuations, first of all, have gone up a lot, but at all periods in time are worth more. And so in the last quarter, SaaS companies were trading at just below 5x revenue. And the reason why they're worth more is because of the predictability. There's a certainty premium for SaaS companies. If I'm selling an enterprise piece of software, I'm only as good as my last quarter. And I don't know what my next quarter is going to be like. It's all lumpy. It all comes in the last 10 days of the quarter. It's hard to predict. Whereas if I'm selling software as a service and I'm down at 2% churn, I begin each year already knowing a meaningful portion of what my revenue is going to be for that year. So I just find that it's investors love that, obviously, and it helps them price the stock. And ultimately, winning at SaaS, to me, there's a bunch of elements. Sorry, I had to. First of all, keep it really simple. Solve one thing for one set of customers out of the gate. Feel free to expand your footprint over time, but stay razor focused. don't build a Swiss Army knife. Definitely talk to users. I go back to the Tungle example. You know, after we raised, when I first joined, I spent the first 3 months raising money. And after we raised money, we had years of cash in the bank. We were pre-revenue, I had nothing to do. So I literally reached out to every single user who signed up for the service. I said, hey, I'm Mark, here's Jason who runs support. If you have any issue, you reach out to us. And I found that we had a 25% response rate to that, which meant 2 things. First of all, automate that email. But second, and this is particularly true with free apps or services, the battle to retain users begins the second they sign up. And if there isn't an automated onboarding and you haven't reached out and it doesn't work for them, they're gone. They're not going to come back again and try and figure it out. And we found, particularly with our Outlook users, because Outlook is such a bear to work with, that they had issues in onboarding and trying to get this little connector to send Outlook data to us. And we only uncovered that because we were talking to users. We also did focus groups all the time. We literally, I think in the first 6 months that we launched, first 6 months after we launched, we did a one-on-one usability session every day of the week. We slowed that down over time once we felt we had kind of nailed it a bit, but we still did it, once or twice a week. So you got to be talking to users. You need to measure, I think, literally everything. At the end of the day, it comes down to those high-level kind of conversion rates that we talked about. But there are so many companies I've been involved with that have started trying to solve one problem and realize that they solve another problem and kind of move into that. And the only way you find that out is, first of all, by talking to people, and second, by really measuring what's happening on your site or service. So I think whether it's click tracking or eyeball, heat maps, there's a whole bunch of things that you can use to really optimize that acquisition funnel. But actually measuring where people are spending time inside your app will help, and then talking to users is going to help you really uncover that benefit and focus hard on that. So you need to measure everything. And ultimately, I find that drives most vendors to build in-house analytics, because every use case is different, and the commercial packages are not Swiss Army knives. They kind of solve most of your use cases, but not all of them. On pricing, my message there is don't be afraid to charge. In Tungle's case, we charged quite late, and we debated it. We thought we probably could and should have charged earlier. But I know many startups are kind of hesitate on charging, and I think that it's supremely useful data to go and ask customers for money and then either get it or not get it. I think you really want that feedback. And it doesn't matter if you're getting 60 or $100 a month, it's all good. It's not even about the money, it's about that market intelligence that you're building something that people want enough to pay you.
How do you deal with that really early on when, again, the philosophy is to get out as early as possible?
Yeah.
Where you're less likely to be in a position to charge money, but therefore all your metrics tell you a different story, because even if it's you're spamming your friends, their usage when they're not paying completely different. So how do you deal with that kind of dynamic on a beta, a lengthy beta program where you're upfront with your intention to charge in the future, still gives you different information than if you're charging right from the beginning?
Yeah, and so charging in the future, I'm going to take a tangent and deal on one point there, which is this: if you tell people you're going to charge in the future, so it's kind of a limited time free, I find that is a real friction point. It should either be, because what I find is users don't want to invest the time to really get up and running and be successful with the application, because they don't know how much it's going to be in the future and they don't know whether they're going to pay you. And so I find it turns off a lot of people. So I do think that if you have either you're right up front, this is how much it costs, but here's a free trial, which is what Shopify does, or whether you just have a standalone free base version, which is what Freshbooks does, I find that's a better way. And as for your data, yeah, I mean, if you are spamming your friends and saying, please give me money, that's not going to be a meaningful proxy for the market as a whole. But if strangers are pulling out their credit cards, then that's huge data, especially if you know the source of those users and there are some trends there. If who those users are, if there's certain verticals that you're really strong in. Tungle, we never ever dreamed of going after college professors, and yet it turned out to be a huge segment for us. We only knew that because we were mining our database and seeing a whole bunch of university email addresses, and then we're reaching out to them. So to me, it's more about the data and knowing that you're building something that the market wants than
I think
than the revenue.
Taking out of that actually is if you're coming out as soon as possible with a limited feature set that you ideally will be embarrassed about in the future,
Mm-hmm.
you have your pricing strategy done, or the first iteration of your pricing strategy done and communicated to whatever user base you're going after right from the beginning.
Right. I'm not saying you have to. There's plenty of companies that do the pricing later. I'm just saying don't be afraid to charge.
Right.
Because don't forget, your early users are going to be early adopters. And they're going to be there because they really get this pain and they are more tolerant of early crappy betas than the mass market. And I think doesn't mean that if your product doesn't evolve, it doesn't mean that you're done with your product, but you are legitimately solving needs for those early adopter users. Daniel, you had a question.
I realized it was more of a comment than anything. I guess the challenging part is once you come up with a pricing strategy, how do you iterate your pricing with existing users?
Oh, great. Yeah. In most cases, you have to grandfather.
Yeah.
So,
keep
yeah.
them on the legacy.
Yeah. Or give them a very long time to transition. Yeah. And pricing can go up. I have many companies I've been involved in that started out at one level, realized they could charge more and did it and kept their customers. They did grandfather, but the point is like their conversion rates didn't start going down once they moved to the next kind of pricing level.
I think I was looking at kind of the difference between HubSpot and even Shopify compared to a lot of products.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's clearly hard as if in dollars versus time. I think like Shopify, for example, competes a lot more on the time side than other competitors.
No, Shopify is a store. Like if you
Yeah.
want to sell stuff online, like this is the store.
I mean, in terms of their design features versus core
versus
market-
building yourself.
versus a lower, for example, rate or an additional marketing benefit, right? So I think like the thing I'm going through now is like thinking through our pricing. We realize we can charge a lot more if we charge on performance rather than just on time. Again,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you're delivering a hard measurable benefit,
Mhm.
you can charge more.
Okay.
That's for sure. Michael?
Have you seen any patterns around like just the number pricing? So instead of 5, do 4 or 7 or something, or instead of 10, 9, 12?
Yeah, there isn't the usual $9.99 marketing stuff that you see in consumer goods. I do find that if you charge $5 a month, you're not going to build a big company. The user's never worth enough. You can't spend enough in acquisition channels, and if you're going after something big, keywords just cost way too much, and so you have to be, I find the companies that are worth looking at as an investor tend to be charging 20 and up.
And what about if there's going to be multiple instances of the same thing that a user will buy, and doing that as a 5, 5, 5, and they just build up incrementally per thing that they're doing, versus just giving them a group account, a bulk account?
Well, I would have a couple of reservations. One, so if you go back to that, so Freshbooks, Shopify has a similar pricing tier to Freshbooks there. They got like kind of 5 packages.
Yeah.
And notwithstanding that you do have all these different price points, I find that when you're in high growth mode, you're always adding users at the base price plan. And so if you want to grow fast, you need to have profitable per user economics that allow you to spend a lot and be profitable at that base 5 plan. So my first reservation would be, can you do that? Can you really grow fast if people are entering just paying you $5 a month? And then second, is it clear enough as to why I need these other things, or are you inducing friction by giving me multiple kind of purchasing decisions, you know? That's the other point. And the last point on which we talked about in terms of winning at SaaS really is it's all about service. And that was my whole point before, just about kind of showering your users with love. And if you really do that, if that is part of your culture, users are going to refer other users are going to stay more, they're going to give you product feedback, they're going to be willing to pay you money. I find it's just an absolute key success factor for every SaaS startup I've ever been involved with. And that, I think, is it. So happy to take any remaining questions you have. Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
In terms of pricing packages, what do you think in terms of pricing for more usage versus pricing for additional functionality or features? And you know, how do you think about building packages around that?
I think that I think that usage-based billing models are risky for most startups, because while margins for most SaaS companies are very high, and so you're very happy if customers use it, but you're also really happy if they don't use it. So like eFax, right? You pay $19 a month, maybe you get 2 faxes a month, which means it's costing you $10 per fax. It's like crazy. And if they charge on a usage basis, the revenue would be way, way lower than what it is. So I think that you don't want to take the risk on billing just for usage unless you're at the API like a data as a service level. You're a Oz or an Amazon. We have a company called Context.io that's email data as a service. So that makes sense because you're sort of a utility that plugs in. But I think if you're an end user app, you want to charge a fixed fee. And I think also myself as an end user, I don't want to be making a purchase decision every time I use the thing, right? It costs me this amount per month, and it's just, I'm used to seeing it, and that's it.
Okay. And my follow-up question would be, so let's take an example of you have 4 killer features that you might charge for in terms of adding a functionality. What do you think about having your one basic feature and then just having a second package that has everything versus stratifying out more and adding complexity in your packages?
Depends. There you go. That's the takeaway there. I think that so many SaaS companies I find have like 5 pricing tiers. I find that's too much. 3 strikes me as a perfectly good number. As I mentioned with Dropbox, who really has 2, like you can either get the small or the really big. I find that they could have a bit more intricacy and get more money. But I think it really comes down to the specific benefit that you're trying to solve. So I would say 2 is probably too much. 5 is probably too many if I had to generalize. Yep.
Do you have any tools that you use kind of across your companies for things like billing and stuff? I mean, if you're billing, 100,000 users, $10 a month, I mean, obviously that has to be automated. Can you recommend some tools there?
Yeah. I should have put that in the slide. I will. Let me see which tools our companies are using, and when I stick it up on my blog, I'll add a slide because that's a good point. Yep.
What's your take on using time-limited discounts to build a demand curve? So if you think the absolute most you could get is maybe $50 a month from someone, do a 50% discount to see how many people are willing to pay at $25 a month. Is that valuable in your experience?
Well, I think the challenge with that is you're acquiring users every month. Mm-hmm. So I think that would become sort of a permanent thing, right?
Right.
It's not like an end of quarter, right? If you buy now, and then I don't have to do that again until the next quarter. So I haven't seen that used very often, to be honest. And I find that if price is a major component of the purchase decision, the product is probably not quite right. Price should never be an impediment for SaaS if you're selling to an individual user. If you're selling to an enterprise in a sales cycle a la HubSpot, then it definitely is an issue. and they're probably expecting discounts because they're used to that for all their enterprise software, even though they're paying you on a subscription basis. But if it's as something that you as an individual user sign up for with a credit card, I find that price should not be a barrier. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Are you familiar with Wave Accounting?
Yeah. Free.
With that particular business model, can you comment on what might be a valuation and how it compares with a typical SaaS?
Yeah, I think they have a similar business model to Mint, right? So it's lead gen. And so it really comes down to the size of their engaged user base. So not people who have accounts, but people who are really using it. And their click-through rates to sign up for partner services. And that's going to establish over time some value to each user account. And that would be used to determine the value.
And it's a longer cycle with
Yeah.
that type of model? Yeah.
For sure.
Okay.
Are you involved with Wave?
No.
Okay.
Just interested.
Okay. Yep.
In terms of the strategy between going, like you said, choose one first, whether it's business or consumer. And I don't know what Salesforce started off with first. Do you know if they were business first or consumer first?
Oh, business. Business for sure. Do they even have it? Do they have a consumer solution? Or you mean consumer as in like I can sign up for an account?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that came later. I mean, they may have had a trial, but I mean, they've had an inside Salesforce from the beginning.
Okay. Now, yeah, I always want to know that first, and then kind of like versus in Canada, it seems like that's the model that people tend to support more than rather than get a bunch of users and then kind of figure out how to do it afterwards.
I think that's partly due to availability of capital, which is
Right.
not available.
Right.
Other than our fund, we got money.
Good to hear.
Yep.
Your comments a moment ago about business model based on usage, how that's not a great idea for startups like this. Would you say those comments apply as well to a business founded on sort of a commission model, like for instance a system for handling online ticketing that generated revenue from taking money off of?
No, because you're in a transaction flow there, and it's easy to extract value.
I'm curious, are there many SaaS or SaaS-like businesses that are founded with that model that you've heard of, or is that sort of a very kind of weird thing?
Well, ticketing is a clear example, right? There's a guest list app here in Toronto that charges the exact, it's the same business model. At Shopify, we have a two-pronged business model. We have a subscription and we take a transaction fee, but subscriptions are definitely kind of the bread and butter of the business. I'm not aware of many others, to be honest.
Thanks.
Yep.
As an investor, then, when you're talking about prepayment, so if the economics on SaaS are much more pleasing than traditional perpetual businesses, the economics on prepay are also within the SaaS world much more interesting. So do you think there's going to be some pressure from the investment community to sort of move these businesses to sort of seek prepayment in their SaaS models? There's a lot of benefits for the customer to signing up for SaaS.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the monthly payment and the sort of the lower risk entry from that perspective, but it's not the only benefit.
Right. Well, the best source of financing is sales, right? And if I were a greedy investor, I would say, don't get your customers to prepay, I'll just give you more capital and you give me more of your company, right? But I think there's a variety of financing sources that you can use. And you need that initial base of equity. I think certainly for us as seed investors, we're a small fund. We're very aligned with our entrepreneurs where we're quite happy if customers start contributing lots of cash into the business. But over time, you can also look at bank debt, which you can't do out of the gate. If you have proven customer metrics, you know how much that is worth over time. There's kind of very progressive lenders, Silicon Valley Bank being one, that can get their heads around that and kind of give you sort of a line of credit based on future value of a customer. So there are lots of ways to do it, but certainly for us, we would be very in favor of prepay. And I would say that for you as an entrepreneur, if you come in and talk to an investor and talk about a percentage of your base that is prepaying, that is a clear endorsement of your customer base and is going to make us more excited. Any other questions? All right, cool. Thank you very much.